In the spring of 1315, rain began to fall across northern Europe, and it did not stop for the better part of 2 years. Fields that had fed the continent for 3 centuries turned to standing water. Grain rotted on the stalk before it could be harvested, and in the markets that survived long enough to keep records, the price of wheat in some regions climbed to more than 8 times its normal cost. This was not a plague, and it was not a war. It was weather, and it exposed how little separated a functioning kingdom from a starving one. This is quiet history at bedtime. If this is the kind of story that holds your attention, a subscribe means everything right now. Every detail in this account comes from government archives, legislative records, and current academic research on the period. Just relax and let this play as you drift into sleep. Now, let us begin. For 300 years before the rain came, Europe had been getting warmer. The period modern climate reconstructions call the medieval warm period stretched from roughly the 10th century to the end of the 13th, and it changed what the continent could grow and where. Vineyards grew in southern England, 100 miles north of where grapes can reliably ripen today, with recorded plantings as far north as Yorkshire and the fen country near Ely. Grain that once struggled at higher elevations and higher latitudes began to succeed there instead, and farmers followed the warmth into land that had never been farmed before. The population followed the food. Between the year 1000 and the year 1300, the number of people living in Europe roughly doubled, rising from somewhere near 35 million to a figure closer to 70 or 80 million. That growth was not gradual and uniform. It clustered where the new warmth made farming possible, and it pressed hardest on land that had never been asked to support permanent settlement before. By 1300, England held somewhere close to 5 or 6 million people, France closer to 17 or 19 million, and the German territories a comparable share, spread across a more fragmented political map. Flanders, though small in territory, carried one of the highest population densities anywhere in Europe. Its farmland asked to support both its own rural population and the swelling cloth towns built on top of it. Forests came down in wide belts across France, Germany, and England, cleared by a process contemporaries called assarting, the slow conversion of woodland into plowland, parcel by parcel, generation by generation. Wetlands were drained in the Low Countries and eastern England, their reclaimed soil rich but unstable, dependent on a network of dikes and ditches that required constant maintenance. That maintenance was not optional, and it was not cheap. Every dike that held back the sea or a swollen river represented ongoing labor obligations owed by nearby tenants, and a community that let its dikes fail in a dry year could find that same land submerged the moment rainfall increased even slightly beyond normal, a vulnerability that meant some of Europe's most productive new farmland was also its most fragile, built on a bargain with water that assumed the water would behave. Hillsides that would have been left to pasture a century earlier were terraced and planted instead. The marginal land had a name for a reason. It produced a marginal harvest, one that could feed a family in a good year and fail them completely in a bad one. By 1300, a large share of Europe's cultivated land fell into this second category, productive only under favorable conditions and offering almost no buffer when conditions turned. The system had been built for warmth and for rain in moderation, and it had no answer for either running out. England had lost most of its ancient forest cover by this point, with woodland reduced to a small fraction of what had stood there before the clearing began. What forest remained was not wilderness but managed land, cut for timber and fuel on a schedule that left little room to absorb any sudden new demand. The yield medieval farmers could expect from their fields made the entire system fragile in a way that is easy to overlook. A field of wheat in a good year might return only 3 or 4 grains harvested for every 1 grain planted, a ratio that modern industrial agriculture would consider a near total crop failure. Out of that already thin return, a portion had to be set aside immediately before any of it reached a table. Seed grain for the following year's planting had to come from the current harvest, which meant that a poor yield did not just mean less food, it meant less seed, and therefore a smaller planting, and therefore a smaller harvest the year after that, even if the weather improved. This built-in delay was one of the most dangerous features of the medieval agricultural system, and it would matter enormously once the rains of 1315 arrived. A single ruined harvest did not simply cost a single year of food. It could cost the following year's planting as well, compounding a 1-year disaster into a 2- or 3-year one before a drop of rain fell twice. Land tenure varied somewhat from kingdom to kingdom, though the underlying vulnerability did not. In England, the open field system scattered a tenant's holdings across many small strips within a few large shared fields, worked communally under rules set by the manor court. In France, a similar arrangement operated under seigneurial obligation, with tenant farmers owing dues and labor to a local lord in exchange for the right to work a plot of his land. Across the German territories, a comparable structure known to modern scholarship as Grundherrschaft bound peasant households to estates in a relationship that combined rent, labor, and legal subordination in varying proportions from region to region. What mattered in the spring of 1315 was not which version of feudal obligation a household lived under. It was that all 3 versions shared the same underlying design: fixed claims on a variable harvest with no built-in mechanism for reducing those claims when the harvest failed. Monasteries occupied an unusual position within this system, and their estates functioned, in ordinary years, as one of the closer things medieval Europe had to an emergency reserve. Cistercian and Benedictine houses across England and the continent managed large agricultural granges, and some maintained grain stores intended to last through a bad season and support almsgiving to the poor at their gates. Those reserves were real, but they were not built for the scale of failure that was coming. A monastery could feed the destitute of its immediate area through 1 lean year without difficulty. It had no capacity to do the same for an entire kingdom through 3 lean years in a row, and the abbots who managed these estates in 1315 had no way of knowing yet how badly that capacity would be tested. England's economy carried an additional layer of complexity that the rest of Northern Europe shared to a lesser degree. Alongside grain farming, much of the kingdom's rural land was given over to sheep, and the wool that came from those flocks fed a cloth trade that connected English wool merchants directly to the weaving towns of Flanders. This trade meant that English and Flemish prosperity were already linked before the famine began, through ships that carried raw wool east and finished cloth back, and through merchants whose fortunes rose and fell together. When grain failed on both sides of that trade route at once, The connection that had made both economies richer in good years offered no relief in a bad one, because a merchant fleet could carry wool and cloth, but it could not conjure grain that did not exist anywhere within reach. Market towns and seasonal fairs formed the final layer of this economic structure, the physical points where surplus grain from a good harvest was bought, sold, and redistributed toward wherever demand was highest. Regional fairs, some of them centuries old by 1300, functioned as the clearinghouses of the medieval economy, moving not just grain, but wool, cloth, and credit across considerable distances. This system worked well precisely because it assumed that failure, when it came, would be local: a flood in one valley, a poor yield on one estate, leaving other regions with surplus to sell. It had never been tested against a failure that arrived everywhere at once, and in the spring of 1315, that was exactly the test it was about to face. The farming method itself compounded the risk. Across most of northern Europe, the dominant system was three-field rotation. One field planted with a autumn grain such as wheat or rye, a second planted with a spring crop such as oats or barley, and a third left fallow to recover. This system was an improvement over what came before it, and it allowed roughly 2/3 of a manor's arable land to be productive in any given year rather than half. But it also meant that a single bad growing season struck at the heart of the harvest twice, once in the autumn planting and again in the spring, leaving almost no crop untouched by whatever had gone wrong. Grain itself was the foundation of the medieval diet, in a way that has no direct modern equivalent. Bread supplied the majority of daily calories for most of the population, supplemented by ale brewed from the same grain, with meat, dairy, and vegetables filling a comparatively small share of the plate. This meant that grain failure was not simply an economic event. It was a direct threat to the physical mechanism by which the population stayed alive from one week to the next. Storage offered little protection. Peasant households typically held enough grain in reserve to survive a partial shortfall, a few months at most, because storing more than that required infrastructure, security, and capital that most rural households did not have. Manor lords and monasteries held larger reserves, sometimes enough to bridge a single bad year for their own households and tenants. But those reserves were built for one failed harvest, not two, and certainly not three. Above the peasant household sat a legal structure that made the risk worse rather than better. Most agricultural land in Europe was held under feudal tenure, meaning that a tenant farmer owed fixed obligations to a lord: rent, labor service, a share of the harvest, regardless of whether that harvest had succeeded or failed. A bad year did not lower what was owed. It simply meant that the tenant had to choose between paying the lord and feeding the household, and in the years that followed 1315, that choice would be made by millions of people at once. The church added a second fixed claim on the same shrinking harvest: tithes, a tenth of a household's produce, owed to the local parish regardless of how good or bad the year had been, were collected on the same schedule whether the fields had yielded abundantly or barely at all. Royal treasuries added a third. Across much of Europe, the years leading up to 1315 had already seen rising taxation to fund military campaigns. The English crown drawing revenue from its wars in Scotland, the French crown from its long entanglement with Flanders, and rural households were already paying more into those wars than they had a decade earlier. None of these obligations were designed with malice, and none of them were unusual by the standards of the time. But stacked together, feudal rent, church tithe, royal tax, they meant that a tenant farming household entered any bad year already owing a fixed share of a harvest that had not yet been grown, with no mechanism in place to adjust that share downward if the harvest failed. In a household of modest means, this arithmetic left almost no margin at all. A woman managing a small holding with her children while her husband worked a lord's fields for part of the week might calculate, in an ordinary year, that the grain in the loft would last until the next harvest with careful rationing and little to spare, a margin thin enough that a single delayed shipment or a wet month of storage could tip a family from adequate to hungry long before any crisis reached the scale of a continent. Cities added a second layer of exposure that the countryside did not share. The textile towns of Flanders, Ghent, Bruges, and Ypres among them had grown into some of the most densely populated urban centers north of the Alps, with populations in the tens of thousands supported almost entirely by trades other than farming. Weavers, dyers, and merchants in these cities produced cloth, not grain, and depended on a constant flow of imported food from the surrounding countryside and from longer trade routes running through the Baltic. That dependence worked well when harvests were reliable. It became a liability the moment they were not. England had grown in a similar direction, though on a smaller scale. London's population had climbed past 60,000 by 1300, and while the city sat within reach of some of the richest farmland in the kingdom, it too relied on a functioning transport and market system to move grain from field to table. That transport system was slower and more fragile than it looked. Overland roads were poorly maintained and frequently impassable in wet weather, which meant that the movement of bulk grain over any distance depended heavily on rivers and coastal shipping rather than carts and horses. This dependence on water transport had a hidden consequence that would only become clear once the crisis began. A regional grain surplus could, in theory, be shipped to a regional grain deficit. Baltic grain moving west to feed Flemish cities was already an established pattern by 1300, but that solution only worked if the shortfall was regional in the first place, and if the same weather that ruined one harvest had not also disrupted the roads, rivers, and harbors needed to move a rescue shipment in. Every part of this arrangement, the expanded population, the marginal land under plow, the thin yield ratios, the fixed feudal and church and royal obligations, the urban dependence on imported grain moved by fragile transport, had been built during roughly 3 centuries of climate that cooperated. Nothing in the system had been designed to survive a climate that stopped cooperating, because for 300 years, no one alive had needed to plan for that. The first sign that the pattern was changing came earlier than most people who lived through the crisis of 1315 would ever have recognized. Modern reconstructions of North Atlantic weather patterns place the beginning of a long-term shift toward cooler, wetter conditions in northern Europe somewhere in the final years of the 13th century. The shift was not dramatic at first. A slightly cooler summer here, a wetter autumn there, the kind of variation that any farming society absorbs without alarm, because farming societies had always dealt with a bad year now and then. Modern climate science attributes much of this transition to a change in the North Atlantic Oscillation, a large-scale pattern of pressure differences over the ocean that governs how far north and how far south the storm tracks bringing rain to Europe tend to sit in a given year. No one in the 14th century had a name for this pattern, or any way to observe it directly, and they had no need to. Its effects arrived simply as weather, indistinguishable at first from ordinary variation. In 1314, that variation became more noticeable. Chronicles from England and parts of the continent describe a wet, cool growing season that reduced the harvest below its usual yield, though not so far below that anyone treated it as a crisis. The same pattern appeared, in milder form, across parts of France and the German lands. A late, damp summer meant grain that took longer to ripen and came in lighter than expected, but harvests of this kind had happened before, roughly once in a decade, and communities had inherited ways of managing them. Grain reserves absorbed the shortfall. Prices rose somewhat, tenants and lords adjusted, and by the end of the year, most of Europe had reason to expect that the following season would return to normal, because that was what every prior irregular year had done. There was no institution anywhere on the continent whose purpose was to notice that this irregular year might be the first of several rather than an isolated one. No crown, no church, and no merchant house tracked weather patterns across borders in a way that could have connected a wet summer in England to a wet summer in Poland. And even if such a connection had been noticed, nothing in the administrative capacity of a 14th century kingdom could have translated it into meaningful preparation. It did not. The winter of 1314 into 1315 was mild and wet across much of northern Europe, and the spring that followed brought rain that arrived earlier, fell harder, and lasted longer than anything in living memory for the people who worked the land. Fields that needed to dry before plowing stayed waterlogged into what should have been the planting season. Seed that did go into the ground sat in soil too saturated to support the root systems young grain needed, and in low-lying fields across England, France, and the Low Countries, standing water simply did not drain. No single village understood what was beginning. Each community saw only its own flooded fields, its own late planting, its own anxious calculation of what a smaller harvest would mean for the winter ahead, not yet aware that the same rain was falling, at the same time, across almost the entire continent. That awareness would come later, once the scale of the failure became impossible to explain away as one region's bad luck. For now, in the early months of 1315, farmers did what farmers had always done when the weather turned against them. They waited for it to clear. In a small holding somewhere on the edge of a manor, the kind of household whose name was never recorded because it never needed to be, a family would have made the same calculation that thousands of others were making at the same time, judging whether to plant a smaller field early in hope of a dry spell, or wait and risk missing the planting season altogether. There was no way from inside that decision to know which choice was correct, because there was no precedent for what the summer of 1315 was about to become. Every farmer in northern Europe was, without knowing it, running the same experiment at the same time, and every one of them was about to receive the same answer. The rain did not clear. It continued through the spring, into the early summer, falling on fields that had already been planted and on fields that had not. By the time anyone could see the pattern clearly enough to name it, the harvest of 1315 was no longer a season that could be saved. It was a season that would have to be survived. What made this different from the difficult year of 1314 was not yet obvious to anyone living through it, and it would take the failure of a second harvest and then a third before the full shape of the crisis became clear. But the conditions that turned a wet spring into a continental catastrophe were already in place by the time the first drops fell. a population near the edge of what its land could support, a farming system with almost no reserve, and a web of fixed obligations that could not bend to meet a harvest that no longer existed. The rain that fell across northern Europe in the spring of 1315 did not behave like an ordinary storm system passing through. It settled, returning week after week over England, northern France, the Low Countries, and the German territories stretching toward Poland, as if the entire region had come under a single weather pattern that refused to move on. Fields that had been planted in April sat under standing water through May. Where the water eventually receded, the soil beneath it had been compacted and stripped of the loose structure that young roots needed, leaving seedlings weak even in the patches that had not drowned outright. Major rivers across the affected region rose well beyond their normal banks that season. The Seine flooded low-lying farmland outside Paris. The Rhine spread across cultivated ground in the German territories, and the Thames pressed against the defenses that kept it out of low areas near London, each overflow claiming farmland that had been counted on for that year's harvest before the rivers ever reached their crest. Grain that did survive to the growing season faced a second problem that dry years never produce. Wheat and rye need a period of sun and warmth to ripen properly in their final weeks, converting stored starch into the dense kernel that makes a viable harvest, and that ripening window simply did not arrive. Stalks stayed green and soft into what should have been harvest time, heavy with moisture and prone to rot before they could be cut. In field after field, farmers watched grain that had technically survived the growing season fail at the very last step, spoiling on the stalk in the days it should have been gathered in. Labor itself became harder to organize under these conditions because the traditional rhythm of the agricultural calendar assumed a predictable window for each stage of work: plowing, planting, weeding, cutting, drying, storing, and that predictability had collapsed. Manor courts, which normally scheduled communal labor obligations around a known sequence of tasks, found themselves adjusting those schedules week to week as fields that should have been ready for cutting stayed too wet to enter, while other tasks piled up behind them unfinished. Even where a crop reached the point of cutting, the harvest itself became a different kind of ordeal. Grain needs to be dried after cutting, spread and turned in open air or under cover until moisture content drops low enough for safe storage, and that drying process depends entirely on stretches of dry weather that the summer of 1315 was not providing. Sheaves left standing in wet fields began to sprout where they lay, the grain inside germinating prematurely in conditions that should have been preserving it instead. Grain that sprouted before storage was no longer viable as bread flour in any useful sense, and a harvest that had already been reduced by the failed planting season was reduced again by a spoiled harvest season layered directly on top of it. The result, when manors and villages finally totaled what they had brought in, was a yield that fell far short of even a cautious estimate. Regional records that survive from parts of England and France suggest harvests in 1315 running at roughly half of a normal year's output, and in some low-lying areas hit hardest by flooding, considerably less than that. A shortfall of this size had no precedent within living memory for anyone working the land that year. The three-field system that ordinarily left a fallow field in reserve offered no help here, because the failure had struck both the planted fields at once, the autumn grain and the spring grain together, leaving nothing held back to fall to. Transport, which had always been the mechanism for moving a regional surplus toward a regional shortfall, offered no relief either. The same rivers that had overflowed their banks and ruined standing crops were, in many places, too swollen and too dangerous for the barges that normally carried grain between market towns, and roads already poor in dry weather became close to unusable after months of near constant rain. A merchant with grain to sell in one town and a buyer waiting in another faced delays measured in weeks rather than days, and grain that did move faced spoilage risk of its own in transit, sitting damp in a cart or a barge hold for longer than intended. The infrastructure that had quietly made the fair and market system function in ordinary years turned out to be exactly as fragile as the harvest it was meant to support, failing at the same moment and for the same underlying reason. The grain that was harvested carried a second danger that added illness to hunger. Rye, one of the staple bread grains across much of northern Europe, is vulnerable in wet, cool conditions to a fungus that produces a toxic compound when the infected grain is milled into flour and baked into bread. Consumption of bread made from this contaminated grain could cause a range of severe physical symptoms, and households already choosing between hunger and whatever grain they could find had little practical ability to inspect their flour for a threat they had no way of detecting by sight. In a year when every available grain was being pressed into use regardless of its quality, this added a layer of physical danger to a crisis that was already, at its core, a matter of not having enough to eat. Grain prices responded immediately, and they responded in a way that reveals how thin the margin between adequate and desperate had always been. In parts of England, the price of wheat had roughly tripled by the autumn of 1315 compared to what it had cost a year earlier, and in the most affected regions of the Low Countries, surviving price data points to increases climbing toward 4 and 5 times normal levels before the winter was over. This was not simple scarcity pricing in the modern economic sense. It was the market registering in real time that the usual buffers, regional surplus, monastic reserve, merchant stockpile, had all failed simultaneously, leaving nothing to moderate the shortage and nowhere nearby to draw replacement grain from. The scarcity forced a change in what bread itself was made from. Millers and households that could no longer afford or find sufficient wheat and rye began mixing in lesser grains, such as oats and barley, that would ordinarily have gone toward animal feed or brewing, and where even those ran short, ground peas, beans, and occasionally bran and chaff were added to stretch what flour remained. The resulting loaves bore only a rough resemblance to ordinary bread, and they offered less nourishment per portion than the bread they replaced, meaning that even a household able to obtain what looked like a normal amount of food was, in practical terms, eating less than the loaf suggested. Brewers faced a related conflict, since the same barley and oats needed for bread substitution were also the base ingredients of ale, and towns had to weigh a shrinking grain supply against two competing essential uses at once. The failure of the harvest did not stop at grain. Hay, the stored fodder that kept horses, oxen, and cattle alive through the winter months, depends on the same dry weather cutting and curing process as grain straw, and the same rain that ruined the wheat also ruined the hay. Meadows that should have yielded a full summer's cutting produced thin, waterlogged growth that rotted where it stood, rather than curing into usable fodder. Farmers who had planned to carry their draft animals and breeding stock through the winter on stored hay found, by autumn, that the hay simply did not exist in the quantity they needed. This left two options, and neither was good. A farmer could try to stretch an inadequate hay supply across an entire winter, weakening every animal on the holding and risking losing them all to starvation before spring. Or a farmer could slaughter part of the herd early, in autumn, converting animals that could not be fed into meat that at least would not starve to death uselessly in a barn. Across the affected regions, a great many farmers chose the second option, and autumn 1315 saw a wave of early slaughter that would have looked, from a distance, like unusual abundance. It was the opposite. It was households liquidating the future productive capacity of their farms, the oxen that pulled the plow, the breeding cows that would have produced next year's calves, because there was no way to keep that capacity alive through the winter ahead. This decision, sensible as it was for any individual household in the moment, created a second-order problem that would not become visible until the following spring. A farm that slaughtered its plow oxen in the autumn of 1315 had no oxen to plow with in the spring of 1316, regardless of what the weather did that year. And a wave of identical decisions made independently across thousands of farms meant that the draft animal shortage of 1316 was already being set in motion before 1315 had even ended. The early slaughter created an immediate and unrelated crisis of its own, because meat, unlike grain, does not keep without active preservation. In the 14th century, the primary method of preserving meat and fish for the winter months was salting, packing the flesh in dry salt or brine, drawing out the moisture that would otherwise allow it to spoil. Salt itself, along much of the North Sea and Atlantic coastline, was produced through a process that depended on exactly the kind of weather that had disappeared. Seawater was evaporated in shallow coastal pans, using a combination of sun, wind, and controlled low heat, a process that required stretches of dry weather to concentrate the brine into usable salt. The salt marshes along the Bay of Bourneuf in western France and the low coastal flats of the Frisian and English shores were among the most productive salt-making regions in northern Europe, supplying preservation salt that moved inland by ship and cart to markets far from the coast itself. Persistent rain and repeated flooding along these same coastlines during 1315 disrupted the pans directly, diluting the brine before it could concentrate and, in some low-lying works, washing the pans out entirely. The same rain that had ruined the grain harvest and the hay crop also shut down salt production along significant stretches of coast where it was normally gathered. Salt pans that should have been producing through the summer sat flooded and useless, and the supply of salt available for the autumn slaughter season fell sharply at the exact moment demand for it spiked. The consequence connected directly back to the animals farmers had just killed. Meat that could not be properly salted began to spoil faster than households could consume it, and a portion of the emergency slaughter that had been meant to convert doomed animals into usable winter food instead produced meat that rotted before it could be eaten, or that had to be consumed immediately and in haste rather than rationed carefully across the winter months. The price of salt itself moved in step with its scarcity, and by the end of 1315 it had become, in some regions, a genuine luxury rather than the ordinary household staple it had always been. A household forced to choose between spending its remaining money on grain or on salt to preserve what little meat it had was, in effect, being asked to choose between two forms of the same emergency, since going without either one carried its own cost. Some communities attempted workarounds where the geography allowed it. Smoking meat over a slow fire offered a partial alternative to salting in places, with access to suitable wood, though it preserved food less reliably and less durably than salt did, and it required fuel that was itself becoming harder to spare as households burned through their wood piles, trying to stay warm through an unusually wet and cold season. Fish, which formed an important part of the diet in coastal regions and during the Church's many meat-free fasting days, faced the identical preservation problem. Herring and other catches that were normally salted and barreled for months of storage instead had to be sold or eaten fresh within days, collapsing what should have been a stored winter resource into a brief and wasteful glut. Herring fisheries along the North Sea coast fed a trade network of their own, moving barreled fish inland to towns that had no direct access to the coast and relied on it as a dependable source of protein through the winter and through the extended periods of fasting the church calendar required. When the barrels that should have carried salted herring inland sat empty or half-filled because there was no salt to fill them with, that inland trade contracted at the same moment that inland grain supplies were contracting, compounding a shortage in one staple with a shortage in another that would ordinarily have offered some relief. Salt's scarcity had a second effect that took longer to register but mattered just as much. Salt was not only a preservative, it was also a basic seasoning and dietary necessity, and its rising price during 1315 and into 1316 added yet another item to the list of essential goods that a struggling household could no longer reliably afford, layered on top of grain prices that had already tripled or more. In the cities, the crisis arrived in a form distinct from what the countryside experienced, though it traced back to the identical cause. Urban populations in Flanders and in the larger towns of England and France produced no food of their own and depended entirely on grain reaching them through the same market and transport networks that had, until this year, always managed to deliver it. Civic authorities in several Flemish towns responded by attempting to fix grain prices at levels below what the open market was demanding, an intervention aimed at protecting urban residents from the worst of the price spike. Ypres and Bruges, among the largest cloth towns in the region, both moved to regulate grain sales within their walls, appointing officials to oversee weights, prices, and the fairness of transactions at the public grain markets. These measures produced a predictable and immediate side effect. Merchants with grain to sell had little incentive to bring it into a town where the price was capped below what they could get elsewhere, and some grain that might otherwise have reached price-controlled markets was diverted to towns willing to pay the uncontrolled rate instead. Some town councils attempted a second approach alongside price control, using civic funds to purchase grain directly and distribute or resell it to residents at a subsidized rate. This required capital that not every town possessed in sufficient quantity, and it required a functioning supply of grain somewhere within reach to purchase in the first place, a condition that became harder to meet as the shortage widened across the entire regions simultaneously. The councils enforcing these price controls were not acting irrationally. They were responding to real and immediate suffering among urban populations who had no land to fall back on and no harvest of their own to hope for, and a fixed price offered at least the appearance of protection against a crisis, with no other obvious remedy available at the town level. But the effect, in practice, often shifted scarcity rather than solving it, moving the shortage toward whichever town controlled its market most strictly, rather than reducing the shortage overall. Outside the town walls, the countryside was already producing a different kind of consequence, that would grow more visible as the crisis went on. Tenants on marginal land, the hillside plots and reclaimed fen ground that had only been brought into cultivation during the population growth of the preceding century, found their already thin yields reduced to almost nothing, leaving them with no harvest to sell, no reserve to draw on, and rent still owed regardless. Some of these households began leaving their holdings before the winter of 1315 had even ended, walking toward towns and market centers in search of paid labor, charity, or simply a place where food might be more available than it was at home. This movement was still small in scale compared to what later years of the crisis would bring, but it marked the beginning of a pattern: rural households abandoning marginal land under economic pressure that would recur and intensify as the famine continued. A household on one of these small holdings, working land that had been cleared from forest only 2 generations earlier, might have faced a choice that thousands of similar households were making independently that winter. Stay on a plot of land that could no longer support a family and hope the following harvest recovered, or abandon it for the uncertain possibility of finding food or work somewhere else. A decision made without any way of knowing that the coming year would bring not recovery, but a second failure layered directly on top of the first. By the closing months of 1315, the shape of the crisis had become impossible to mistake for an isolated regional misfortune. Reports reaching royal and church officials from across England, France, Flanders, and the German lands described the same failure occurring in each place at nearly the same time: flooded fields, spoiled grain, dead or slaughtered livestock, and a coastline that had stopped producing the salt needed to preserve what meat remained. Credit became one of the few remaining tools available to households trying to bridge the gap between an inadequate harvest and the next planting season. Moneylenders and wealthier neighbors extended loans against the promise of future repayment once conditions improved, and some manor lords advanced grain or seed to tenants on the understanding that it would be repaid, with interest in kind, from a future harvest. This form of borrowing worked reasonably well against a single bad year, because both lender and borrower could reasonably expect the underlying problem, one poor season, to resolve itself before the debt became unmanageable. It worked far less well against a crisis that had no clear end in sight, since every loan extended in the winter of 1315 was a bet that 1316 would bring the recovery that 1315 had failed to provide. For households that had survived the year on what reserves they carried into it, the arithmetic for the winter ahead was grim, but not yet catastrophic. A single terrible harvest, however severe, was the kind of event that a resilient rural economy, even one with thin margins, could absorb once, drawing on whatever seed grain, monastic charity, and borrowed credit remained available to bridge the gap until the next planting season. That was the calculation being made in halls and cottages alike, as 1315 came to a close: survive the winter, plant again in the spring, and trust that a single bad year would be followed by an ordinary one, as every irregular season within memory always had been before. Every piece of that calculation depended on an assumption that had held true for as long as anyone could remember: that a disastrous harvest was a rare and self-correcting event, the kind of anomaly a farming society weathered once and then returned from. Seed grain had been set aside, however thin the margin, precisely because no one planning for the spring of 1316 seriously entertained the possibility that the fields would fail in exactly the same way for a second consecutive year before that seed had even gone into the ground. The planting of 1316 would answer that question directly, and it would not answer it kindly. The winter that followed the harvest of 1315 tested every reserve a household had left, and for a great many households, those reserves did not last until spring. Grain that had been rationed carefully through the autumn ran out weeks or months before the next harvest could possibly arrive, leaving a gap that credit, charity, and foraging were asked to fill and could not. Begging, which had always existed at the margins of medieval society, became visible on a scale that towns and manor courts were not equipped to manage. People who had never before needed to ask for food stood at church doors and market gates alongside those who had always relied on charity, and the distinction between the two groups collapsed as the winter wore on. Almshouses and hospitals attached to monasteries, built to serve a modest and fairly predictable number of the chronically poor, found their doors besieged by a far larger population seeking help than their founders had ever anticipated. Some of these institutions exhausted their own grain stores, trying to meet demand that kept growing week after week, leaving them with less capacity to help by midwinter than they had possessed in early autumn, at precisely the moment need was greatest. A prior or abbot managing one of these institutions faced a genuine dilemma with no comfortable resolution. Distributing grain freely to every person who arrived at the gate risked exhausting the house's own stores before winter ended, leaving the monastic community itself at risk of hunger, while turning desperate people away contradicted the charitable purpose the institution existed to serve in the first place. Parish priests, who in ordinary years mediated modest disputes and administered the sacraments, found themselves increasingly drawn into the practical business of distributing what food a parish could gather and deciding, in effect, who among a growing crowd of hungry parishioners would receive it and who would not. No training or precedent had prepared most of them for decisions of this weight, made repeatedly, week after week, with no end in sight. The strain reached even the highest levels of society, in a way that revealed just how completely the shortage had spread. In the late summer of 1315, King Edward II of England, traveling with his royal household on a progress through the country, arrived at a stop where the local supply could not produce enough bread to feed the king's own retinue. This was not a matter of the crown lacking money. Royal purchasing power in ordinary times could secure food from almost anywhere it was needed, and the failure at that stop demonstrated something more significant than a single logistical error, that the shortage had become so complete in some districts that no amount of money could conjure bread that did not exist to be bought. Word of an incident like this traveled quickly through a kingdom already primed to notice every sign of how bad conditions had become. If the king's own table could go without bread, the reasoning went, then no household anywhere could consider itself safe from the same fate, regardless of wealth or status. The incident carried a second implication that would matter more as the crisis dragged on. A king unable to feed his own traveling household was, in the eyes of a medieval population accustomed to viewing the monarch as a figure of divinely sanctioned order, a visible sign that something fundamental had gone wrong in the relationship between the ruler and the natural world he was supposed to preside over. That perception did not translate immediately into political consequence, and Edward II's crown was not directly threatened by a single embarrassing shortage at a single stop on a royal progress. But it added, quietly, to a broader erosion of confidence in royal authority that had been building for other reasons already. And it meant that when the crown later attempted more direct interventions in the crisis, It did so from a position already weakened in the eyes of the people it was trying to help. Spring arrived in 1316 to a population that entered the new planting season in far worse condition than it had entered the previous one. Seed grain that should have been set aside from the 1315 harvest had, in a great many households, already been eaten over the winter, consumed out of necessity by families who could not survive to spring any other way. This left less to plant even where land and labor were available, and it meant that a portion of whatever modest recovery the weather might have allowed was foreclosed before a single seed went into the ground. The compounding delay built into the medieval grain system, described the year before, when a thin harvest meant a thin planting the following season, was no longer a theoretical risk. It had become the operating condition of 1316. Mortality began climbing sharply as the winter of 1315 gave way to the spring of 1316. Though the surviving parish and manor records that allow any estimate of the toll are uneven, better preserved in some regions than others, and largely silent on the poorest households, whose deaths often went unrecorded by any formal institution at all. What evidence does survive points toward death rates in the worst affected areas running well above anything the same communities had experienced in living memory, concentrated heavily among the very young, the elderly, and those already weakened by illness before the famine began. Draft power had thinned as well, following directly from the emergency slaughter of the previous autumn. Farms that had killed their oxen rather than watch them starve for lack of hay now faced the spring plowing season with fewer animals to pull a plow, which meant that even fields where seed was available could not always be worked in time, or could only be worked at reduced scale. A household with one ox instead of two, or none instead of one, could not simply borrow the difference from a neighbor, because most neighbors were making the identical calculation with identical shortages of their own. The result was a planting season smaller in acreage than it should have been, layered on top of a planting season smaller in available seed, two separate shortfalls from the same original cause, arriving together at the worst possible moment. Manor courts, whose records from this period survive in greater number than almost any other source, show the practical effects of this shortage in blunt administrative terms. Entries describe fields left unplowed for want of draft animals, tenants excused from portions of their labor obligation because they lacked the means to fulfill it, and disputes over the borrowing and sharing of the few animals that remained healthy enough to work. These entries, terse as they typically are, offer some of the clearest surviving evidence of how the crisis reshaped ordinary rural administration. Manor stewards, who in ordinary years focused their court sessions on routine matters of inheritance, boundary disputes, and minor infractions, found an increasing share of their time consumed instead by petitions for relief from obligations that tenants simply could not meet, a shift in the daily business of local governance that reflected, in miniature, the larger crisis unfolding across the countryside. Some lords, recognizing that a field left entirely fallow produced nothing at all, allowed tenants to combine what animals and labor they had across several holdings, plowing one another's land in sequence rather than each family struggling alone with inadequate resources. This kind of informal cooperation, largely undocumented in any formal legal sense, likely did more to salvage the 1316 planting season in some areas than any decision made by a lord or a king, though it left little trace beyond the scattered court entries that hint at its existence. The weather of 1316 did not repeat the pattern of 1315 exactly. but it delivered a comparable result by a different route. Where the previous year had brought relentless rain through spring and summer, 1316 brought a colder pattern, with frosts lingering later into the spring than farmers expected, and a growing season that never fully warmed even once the rain eased. Grain planted late into cold and unsettled soil grew slowly and unevenly, and a crop that started behind schedule rarely caught up by harvest time. When the second harvest came in, it fell short again, not always by the same margin as the year before, but short enough that a population with no reserve left from 1315 had nothing to fall back on this time. Regions that had escaped the worst of the 1315 flooding and that had entered 1316 with slightly healthier reserves as a result found little comfort in that advantage once the second failure arrived. A moderate shortfall landing on a population already weakened by a single terrible year produced suffering that a moderate shortfall in an otherwise ordinary decade would never have come close to causing, because the buffer that would normally have absorbed it no longer existed anywhere nearby to draw from. An epidemic among livestock added a further blow to herds that had already been reduced by the previous autumn's emergency slaughter. Cattle and sheep across affected regions began falling to a disease that spread through weakened, poorly fed animals with little resistance left to withstand it, appearing first in isolated herds and then more widely as 1316 wore into 1317. The animals that farmers had managed to preserve through the winter of 1315, the breeding stock and remaining draft oxen kept alive at real cost, were exactly the animals now most exposed to a disease moving through herds already thinned and weakened. A farm that had sacrificed part of its herd the year before to save the rest now risked losing the remainder to sickness, with no healthy reserve anywhere nearby to replace what was lost. The specific nature of the disease moving through cattle and sheep populations during these years is difficult to identify with certainty from the surviving evidence, which describes symptoms and mortality without the diagnostic detail a modern veterinary record would provide. What the record does establish clearly is the outcome. Herds in affected regions lost a substantial share of their animals within a short span, at a moment when those animals represented not just food, but the plowing capacity on which the following year's planting would depend. Contemporary accounts describe the disease spreading fastest through herds already weakened by the same shortage of adequate winter fodder that had driven the emergency slaughter of the year before, a pattern that meant the animals least able to resist infection were often the animals farmers had worked hardest to preserve. This created a cruel symmetry with the human suffering unfolding alongside it, in which the weakest members of any population, whether human households or livestock herds, bore the heaviest burden of a crisis that had begun with something as simple as too much rain. The loss of livestock also struck at wool production, an industry that had grown into one of the most important sources of income for English farming households and for the Crown itself, which taxed wool exports as a major source of revenue. Fewer surviving sheep meant less wool reaching the looms of Flanders, tightening a trade relationship that connected English and Flemish prosperity, and adding a slow-moving economic consequence to a crisis that, in its most immediate form, was still primarily about whether households had enough to eat. The chronicler Johannes de Trocolo, writing at St. Albans Abbey during these years, recorded conditions in England that went beyond simple hunger into a breakdown of ordinary social behavior. He described families in some districts abandoning children they could no longer feed. and he passed along rumors, circulating in the worst affected areas, of desperate people resorting to eating the flesh of the dead. These accounts of cannibalism cannot be verified as literal fact from the surviving record, and Trocolo himself presented at least some of them as report rather than eyewitness certainty. What they demonstrate reliably is not necessarily what people did in every instance, but what people believed was happening around them. A society convinced that its own members had been pushed past every ordinary limit, whether or not every specific rumor was true. Trocolo wrote from within a monastic community that was itself directly engaged in famine relief, giving his account a vantage point close to the practical realities of distributing what charity the abbey could still manage. His descriptions of desperate crowds gathering at religious houses, seeking food, carry a specificity that suggests first-hand observation rather than second-hand rumor, even where his more extreme claims about cannibalism rest on report rather than direct witness. Similar accounts appear in continental sources from the same years, describing comparable extremes of desperation in parts of France and the German territories. The consistency of these reports across regions that had little direct contact with one another suggests, at minimum, that the underlying desperation they describe was real and widespread, even where the most extreme individual claims cannot be confirmed. Child abandonment, unlike the cannibalism rumors, rests on firmer evidentiary ground, appearing in multiple independent sources with enough consistency to be treated as a genuine feature of the crisis rather than rumor alone. Parents who could not feed their children and who had exhausted every other option available to them, in some documented cases, left infants and young children at monastery gates or in the care of wealthier neighbors in the hope that the child might survive under someone else's care when the family's own household could no longer provide even minimal sustenance. Trocolo's chronicle also described the price of ordinary goods climbing to levels that stripped away any pretense of normal commerce, with basic foodstuffs selling, in the worst months, for many times what they had cost only a few years earlier. Poorer households were not simply paying more. In a great many cases, they were being priced out of the market entirely, left to rely on charity, foraging, or theft for whatever food remained available to them. Foraging itself became a widespread and increasingly desperate activity during these years, as households turned to wild resources that would ordinarily have supplemented an adequate diet rather than replaced a missing one. Woodland roots, wild greens, and tree bark ground into a coarse substitute for flour all appear in accounts from the period. Foods eaten not for variety, but because nothing else remained within reach. This kind of foraging carried its own risks. Wild plants gathered in haste and hunger by people with limited botanical knowledge occasionally proved harmful rather than merely unpalatable, and cases of illness or death from misidentified or poorly prepared foraged food appear alongside the more direct effects of starvation in accounts from the period, a secondary hazard produced by a primary shortage that gave people no safer alternative. Domestic animals not normally considered food, including working dogs and, in the most extreme accounts, horses too weak or too old to be of further use for plowing, were reportedly consumed by households with no other source of protein remaining. A working animal converted into food represented, for the household that made that choice, a final conversion of productive capacity into immediate survival, the same underlying calculation that had driven the emergency slaughter of oxen the year before, now extended to animals that would ordinarily never have been considered edible at all. Migration accelerated as conditions worsened through 1316. building on the smaller movements that had begun the previous winter. Rural households abandoned marginal holdings in greater numbers, some seeking charity in towns where monastic institutions still maintained some capacity to distribute food. Others simply wandering in search of any district where the harvest had been slightly less catastrophic than their own. This movement placed additional strain on towns that were themselves already stretched thin, trying to feed their existing populations, creating friction between established urban residents and the growing number of displaced rural arrivals competing for the same limited charity and the same scarce paid labor. Civic authorities in several towns issued restrictions during these years, limiting how long non-residents could remain within the walls, an attempt to manage a strain that no town of the period had the administrative capacity to absorb indefinitely. Theft and disorder increased alongside the hunger, and manor and town court records from the period show a rise in prosecutions for stealing food and livestock during these years, compared to the years immediately before the famine began. Some of this activity was opportunistic, but a significant portion appears to have been driven by households with no remaining legal means of obtaining enough to eat, weighing the risk of punishment against the certainty of going without. Courts in this period faced their own version of the dilemma playing out across the countryside, caught between the ordinary demands of law and the reality that punishing a starving person for stealing bread solved nothing about the underlying shortage that had driven the theft in the first place. Some local officials responded with unusual leniency toward food-related offenses during these years, a pattern visible in reduced sentencing and, in certain cases, in charges quietly not pursued at all, even as the formal law governing theft remained unchanged on paper. Organized crime of a more serious kind also increased, particularly targeting the grain shipments and stored reserves that represented concentrated, valuable targets in a landscape where ordinary food had become scarce almost everywhere. Armed bands attacking grain convoys or raiding manor granaries appear in scattered records from several regions, forcing some lords and merchants to arrange armed escort for shipments that would never have required such protection in an ordinary year. The rising cost of maintaining order added yet another burden to institutions already strained by the famine's direct effects. Manor lords, who might otherwise have used their resources to support struggling tenants, instead found themselves diverting funds toward guards, locks, and the physical security of what stores they had left, a defensive posture that reduced even further whatever capacity remained for charity or relief. By the close of 1316, 2 consecutive harvests had failed across most of northern Europe, and the institutions that might ordinarily have absorbed a single bad year, monastic charity, manorial reserve, royal purchasing power, urban price intervention, had each been tested and found insufficient against a crisis of this duration. The question facing the survivors of that winter was no longer simply how to endure until the next harvest. It had become a question of what, exactly, had allowed a single wet spring in 1315 to cascade into a 3-year, continent-wide crisis, touching kings and peasants alike, when no single decision by any one ruler or institution seemed responsible for the entire collapse. That question would not be answered by the weather alone, and understanding it required looking past the rain itself to the structure of decisions, some made generations earlier, some made in the crisis's own opening months, that had left Europe with almost nothing standing between a bad harvest and a catastrophe. Winter closed in again at the end of 1316 on a population that had now endured 2 consecutive ruined harvests, depleted reserves of seed and livestock, and a mounting toll of hunger, disease, and displacement that showed no sign of a natural endpoint. Whatever came next would depend not simply on what the weather chose to do in the year ahead, but on choices already made by kings, by lords, by the institutions meant to hold a fragile system together, that had shaped how much damage a bad harvest could do long before the rain of 1315 ever began to fall. Some of those choices had already been made generations earlier, embedded in the expansion onto marginal land and the rigid structure of feudal obligation described in the years before the crisis began. Others were still being made in real time by kings and lords weighing interventions whose consequences none of them could fully foresee, decisions that would determine in the years ahead just how deep the damage from these two ruined harvests would ultimately run. No single decision caused the Great Famine, and no single ruler could have prevented it once the rains of 1315 began to fall. But the scale of the catastrophe, 3 years of continent-wide crisis following from a run of bad weather, was not inevitable in the way the weather itself was. It was the product of a system built over 3 centuries on assumptions that stopped being true at almost the exact moment they mattered most. Understanding why the famine became as severe as it did means looking past the rain toward the structure of population, land use, and governance that turned a difficult harvest into a catastrophe. 4 forces combined to produce that result, and none of them operated in isolation. Population growth had pushed farming onto marginal land with no cushion against a bad year. A shifting climate removed the stable conditions that expansion had depended on. A web of fixed feudal, religious, and royal claims left households with no ability to reduce what they owed when a harvest failed, and the responses available to rulers and institutions, however well-intentioned, were built to redistribute food rather than to produce more of it. The first and most fundamental cause was the mismatch between how many people Europe was feeding and how much margin its farming system carried against a bad year. The population growth of the preceding 3 centuries had not simply added more people. It had pushed farming onto land that was only productive under favorable conditions, and it had done so without building any proportional increase in the reserve capacity needed to survive when conditions turned unfavorable. This is sometimes described using a framework developed centuries later by economic thinkers studying the relationship between population and food supply, as a population pressing against the limits of what its land could reliably support. Whatever term is applied to it, the underlying mechanism was simple. More people needed more food required more marginal land, and marginal land offered less protection against exactly the kind of climate disruption that arrived in 1315. This mechanism helps explain a pattern that puzzled observers even at the time. Why a single bad harvest of a kind Europe had certainly experienced before across its long agricultural history produced consequences in 1315 that far exceeded anything recorded in living memory. Earlier centuries had weathered isolated bad years without triggering continent-wide catastrophe. Not because their harvests failed less severely, but because their populations had not yet expanded onto land with so little margin for failure and had not yet built an economic system so tightly stretched across every acre available. The specific regions that suffered most during the famine offer a useful test of this explanation. Areas that had expanded most aggressively onto marginal land during the preceding population boom, the drained fens of eastern England, the hillside terraces of parts of France and Germany, the densely settled farmland surrounding the overgrown cloth towns of Flanders. generally experience some of the famine's harshest effects, while regions that had retained more traditional, lower-intensity farming patterns often fared somewhat better relative to their population. The climate shift itself was the second structural cause, and it operated on a timescale that made it almost invisible to the people living through its early stages. The transition away from the warm, stable conditions of the preceding centuries had begun before 1315, arriving gradually enough that individual bad years, like the wet season of 1314, could still be absorbed and explained away as ordinary variation rather than a sign of lasting change. By the time the pattern became undeniable, in the relentless rain of 1315 and the cold, unsettled growing season of 1316, the population and agricultural system built during the warm period had no time to adjust. A slow climate shift met a population that had expanded rapidly and specifically because of the conditions now disappearing, and the mismatch between the two produced a shock that neither farmers nor rulers had any real preparation to absorb. Modern reconstructions of temperature and precipitation patterns from tree rings, ice cores, and other physical evidence allow this shift to be traced with a precision unavailable to anyone living through it at the time. What these reconstructions show is not a single catastrophic break, but a gradual cooling and wetting trend spanning several decades, punctuated by the specific run of exceptionally severe seasons that struck between 1315 and 1317. That gradual quality is itself part of the explanation for why the crisis caught Europe so unprepared. A sudden, dramatic climate event might have prompted a more visible and urgent institutional response, but a slow drift toward less favorable conditions, interrupted periodically by ordinary variation in either direction, gave no clear signal that anything fundamental had changed until the acute crisis of 1315 arrived without warning. Neither of these forces, population pressure and climate shift, would have produced a crisis of this magnitude on their own without the third structural cause, a body of fixed economic and legal claims that took no account of whether a harvest had succeeded or failed. Feudal rent, church tithe, and royal taxation had all been designed around an assumption of reasonably predictable annual output, extracting a portion of the harvest regardless of how large or small that harvest turned out to be. When rulers and lords did attempt to respond to the crisis directly, their interventions revealed just how limited the available tools actually were, and how often a short-term fix created a new problem in the process of solving an old one. The pattern repeated across multiple kingdoms and multiple forms of intervention, each one a genuine attempt to help, and each one falling short in ways that made the following year harder rather than easier. In France, King Louis X inherited a monetary system already strained by his father's earlier manipulations of the currency, and he continued a practice of adjusting the silver content of French coinage during his brief reign. Debasing the currency in this way allowed the crown to mint more coins from the same quantity of silver, generating short-term revenue that could, in principle, be used to purchase grain or fund relief efforts during the crisis. The consequence undercut the intended benefit almost immediately. A coinage worth less in actual silver content did not buy more grain. It simply meant that more coins were required to purchase the same amount of food, adding currency debasement on top of the underlying scarcity and pushing nominal prices even higher than the shortage alone would have produced. Merchants and grain sellers, recognizing that the coin in their hand was worth less than it had been the year before, adjusted their prices accordingly, and the gap between what a debased currency could buy and what an ordinary household could afford, widened rather than narrowed. A policy intended to give the crown more resources to address the crisis ended up making the crisis somewhat worse for the very households it was meant to help. A direct illustration of how short-term fiscal solutions could compound rather than relieve the underlying shortage. Louis X did not live to see the longer consequences of this policy play out, dying in June of 1316 after a reign of less than 2 years, in the midst of the very crisis his monetary decisions had helped to worsen. His successors inherited both the ongoing famine and a currency whose credibility had been damaged by repeated manipulation, a burden that would complicate French monetary policy for years beyond the immediate crisis itself. The broader pattern illustrated by Louis X's currency decisions extended well beyond France, since debasement of one degree or another had become a common tool of medieval royal finance across much of Europe, employed whenever a crown needed revenue faster than ordinary taxation could reasonably provide it. Every kingdom that reached for this tool during the famine years faced the identical consequence: a short-term gain in nominal revenue purchased at the cost of pushing already desperate prices even higher for households with no ability to absorb the difference. In England, King Edward II's government pursued a different approach, attempting to fix maximum prices on livestock and other goods through royal proclamation in 1315. Aiming to prevent sellers from exploiting the shortage to charge exorbitant rates. The logic behind the measure was straightforward. If prices could be legally capped, ordinary households would be protected from the worst of the price spike, regardless of how severe the actual shortage became. The proclamation covered a range of goods beyond grain itself, including oxen, cows, sheep, and poultry, reflecting a crown attempting to address the crisis on multiple fronts at once, rather than focusing narrowly on bread alone. Royal officials were tasked with enforcing these ceilings at markets and fairs across the kingdom, a significant administrative undertaking for a government whose usual reach into local commerce was considerably lighter. The result was not the protection the crown intended. Sellers facing a legal ceiling on what they could charge simply withheld goods from the market, rather than sell at a loss relative to what buyers in uncontrolled markets elsewhere were willing to pay, and livestock and other regulated goods grew scarcer in the very markets the price controls were meant to protect. Faced with mounting evidence that the policy was making shortages worse rather than better, the English crown repealed the price-fixing ordinance in 1316, an acknowledgement that the intervention had failed to achieve its purpose and had likely made conditions harder for the households it was designed to help. Manor lords, operating at a much smaller scale than kings, faced the same fundamental tension between fixed obligation and variable harvest, and many responded with a form of relief that royal governments found harder to offer: direct reduction of what tenants owed. Lords across affected regions lowered rents, forgave portions of debt, or accepted reduced labor service from tenants who simply could not meet the full terms of their obligations during these years. This kind of flexibility was easier for a lord managing a single estate than for a king governing an entire kingdom, since a lord could observe the specific condition of his own tenants directly and adjust terms accordingly, while a royal proclamation had to apply uniformly across regions whose circumstances varied considerably. This difference in scale helps explain why local, informal accommodation often proved more effective during the crisis than centralized royal policy, even though both were responding to the identical underlying shortage. This flexibility, exercised at the level of individual manors rather than through any centralized policy, likely did more to keep struggling households on their land than any royal intervention managed to achieve. A lord who insisted on full rent from a tenant with no surplus to pay, it risked losing that tenant to death, flight, or default entirely. Outcomes that left the lord with an empty, unworked holding rather than a reduced but still functioning one. The calculation behind these local concessions was practical rather than charitable in most cases, though the effect on struggling tenants was the same regardless of the underlying motive. A lord who accepted less now in exchange for keeping a tenant farming the land and available to resume full obligations once the crisis passed was making a rational bet on the crisis eventually ending, the same bet every household in Europe was making as it tried to survive from one harvest to the next. This local flexibility carried a lasting consequence that would not become fully visible for decades. Once lords across a wide region had demonstrated, out of necessity, that rent and labor obligations could in fact be reduced when circumstances demanded it, the rigid assumption underlying the entire feudal arrangement that a tenant's obligations were fixed and non-negotiable had been quietly undermined, even if no one at the time framed the concessions in those terms. Tenants who had negotiated reduced terms during the famine years retained a memory of that negotiation long after the crisis ended, and lords who wished to restore pre-famine terms in full sometimes found their tenants less willing to simply accept a return to the old arrangement without resistance. This shift was gradual and uneven across different regions and different estates, but it planted a seed of negotiability within a system that had, before 1315, presented itself as fixed by custom and law alike. The Church pursued its own form of response, one aimed less at the material shortage itself and more at the spiritual meaning many contemporaries attached to it. Bishops across affected dioceses organized processions and special masses calling for divine intervention, and religious houses carried relics through the countryside in ceremonies intended to appeal for relief from what many understood as a form of divine judgment or trial. These responses carried genuine importance for a population that understood its world in largely religious terms, offering a framework for making sense of suffering that felt otherwise senseless, and a sense of collective action in the face of a crisis no individual could solve alone. But processions and masses could not plow a flooded field, could not replace a dead ox, and could not make grain that did not exist appear in a market that had none to sell. Some clergy of the period, aware of this limitation even as they led the ceremonies their communities expected of them, framed the crisis in sermons not as a simple failure to be prayed away, but as an occasion for the wealthy to examine their own conduct toward the poor, using the language of moral obligation to press for greater material generosity from those with resources to spare. Whether such appeals meaningfully increased charitable giving beyond what institutions were already providing is difficult to establish from the surviving record, though the appeals themselves reveal an awareness, even within the Church, that spiritual response alone could not answer a crisis rooted in physical scarcity. The Church's charitable institutions did more concrete good than its ceremonial responses, distributing what grain and alms monastic houses could spare to the poor at their gates throughout the crisis. Yet this charity, as already described, operated at a scale that could support the destitute of a single district through a single bad year, not an entire population through 2 or 3. And by 1316 many of these institutions had already given away more than they could safely spare. Individual clergy sometimes went further than their institutions could formally support, using personal resources, or stretching monastic provisions past what prudent management would ordinarily allow, driven by a sense of pastoral obligation that took little account of arithmetic. Some religious houses recorded significant depletion of their own stores as a direct result of this generosity, a choice that reflected genuine moral conviction even as it left the institutions themselves more vulnerable heading into subsequent lean years. The tension between institutional sustainability and immediate charitable need was not unique to the Church, and it echoed the same underlying dilemma facing every institution that attempted to respond to the crisis. A resource that could be given away today to relieve suffering was a resource unavailable to relieve suffering tomorrow, and no institution in 14th century Europe, royal, ecclesiastical, or manorial, had the capacity to expand its total resources quickly enough to escape this basic constraint. What all of these interventions shared, currency manipulation, price controls, rent forgiveness, religious ceremony, charitable relief, was a common structural limitation. Each was designed to redistribute or stretch an existing supply of food and resources, and none of them, however well conceived or sincerely pursued, could increase the actual amount of grain a flooded, frost-damaged field had managed to produce. This is the sense in which every short-term solution available to 14th century governments made the underlying problem harder to escape, rather than easier, not through incompetence or malice, but because the tools available to any ruler of the period operated only on distribution, while the crisis itself was fundamentally a matter of production. A currency debasement that raised prices, a price control that emptied markets, a rent reduction that left a lord with less to invest in recovery. Each intervention addressed the visible symptom in front of it, while leaving the underlying scarcity of actual food completely unchanged. By early 1317, the compounded weight of two ruined harvests, a livestock epidemic, and a series of well-intentioned but ultimately ineffective interventions had pushed large parts of northern Europe close to the limit of what a population could endure. Then, gradually, the weather began to change. The rains that had defined 1315 and shaped the cold, unsettled growing season of 1316 began to ease as 1317 progressed, and the harvest that autumn, while still not fully restoring pre-famine yields in every region, marked the first meaningful improvement in 3 years. The crisis that had begun with weather would end, in large part, because the weather finally allowed it to end. But the Europe that emerged from those 3 years bore little resemblance to the Europe that had entered them. Even this improvement arrived unevenly, and some regions continued to report difficult conditions into 1318 and beyond, a reminder that the underlying agricultural system remained fragile even as the most acute phase of the crisis passed. Recovery, in the sense of restored population, replenished livestock, and rebuilt reserves, would take considerably longer than the return of ordinary weather, since a population once lost could not simply be regrown in a single good season, and livestock herds decimated by disease and slaughter required years of careful breeding to rebuild. The seed grain shortage that had compounded the crisis in 1316 also could not be resolved instantly, since restoring adequate seed stocks required successive good harvests, each one contributing a portion toward rebuilding a reserve that had been depleted over 3 consecutive difficult years. In practical terms, this meant that even as the acute famine ended, the agricultural system that had produced it remained in a weakened, convalescent state for years afterward, still vulnerable to a bad season in a way that a fully recovered system would not have been. Prices, too, took time to settle back toward pre-famine levels, since a market that had spent 3 years pricing in scarcity did not simply reset the moment a single good harvest arrived. Grain prices in most affected regions eased gradually across 1317 and into the years that followed, but the memory of the crisis lingered in commercial practice, in the caution of merchants who had watched supply networks fail completely, and in the wariness of households that had learned, at considerable cost, just how quickly an adequate harvest could turn into nothing at all. The population had been reduced by death and displacement on a scale unmatched by anything in recent memory. The relationships between lords and tenants had shifted, in many places, toward the more flexible arrangements that necessity had forced during the crisis years. And the confidence that had underpinned royal authority, church institutions, and the entire apparatus of feudal obligation had absorbed a shock from which it would not simply bounce back to where it had started. What came next was not a return to the world of 1314. It was the beginning of a different one, shaped directly by what 3 years of failed harvests had broken, and by what they had revealed about the limits of every institution that had claimed, before 1315, to stand between the people of Europe and disaster. That revelation did not disappear once the rain stopped and the harvests improved. The gap it exposed between what feudal Europe promised its people in times of crisis and what it could actually deliver remained visible to everyone who had lived through the famine, and it would shape how survivors understood their relationship to lords, kings, and church alike for the rest of their lives. The improved harvest of 1317 did not undo what 3 years of failure had done. It marked the end of acute crisis, not the beginning of recovery, and the population that emerged from those years into a period of gradually improving weather was smaller, poorer, and structurally different from the population that had entered the crisis in the spring of 1315. Estimating the total mortality of the Great Famine with precision is not possible from the surviving evidence, which varies considerably in quality and coverage from one region to another, and says almost nothing directly about the poorest households, whose losses in these years frequently escaped any formal written notice at all. Working from the parish, manor, and urban records that do survive, the surviving evidence points toward death rates in the hardest-hit regions running somewhere in the range of 10 to 15% of the population over the 3 years of crisis, with some individual communities suffering considerably worse. This range, wide as it is, represents an enormous toll by any standard, concentrated heavily among infants, young children, the elderly, and those whose health had already been compromised before the crisis began. Households that survived the famine intact were, in a great many cases, households that had entered it with somewhat greater resources than their neighbors, a slightly larger reserve, a slightly more diverse set of holdings, a lord somewhat more willing to grant concessions, meaning that the crisis did not strike evenly across the social order, even within the peasantry itself. This uneven distribution of survival carried forward into the structure of rural society for years after the acute crisis ended. Households that had weathered the famine with land, tools, and at least some surviving livestock intact were positioned to absorb the holdings of neighbors who had not survived or who had abandoned their tenancies, gradually consolidating somewhat larger farms than had been typical before the crisis in regions where enough land had been vacated to make such consolidation possible. A widow on one such holding, managing land that had belonged to her husband's family for 3 generations, offers an illustration of the kind of calculation many survivors faced once the worst of the crisis had passed. With her husband among the dead and 2 of her 4 children lost to the famine years, she found herself with more land than her remaining household could easily work, and a neighboring family, reduced to nothing by the same crisis, offering to share labor across both holdings in exchange for a portion of what they helped bring in. Arrangements of this kind, informal and undocumented in any surviving court roll, likely proliferated quietly across the countryside in the years immediately following the famine, as households reorganized themselves around whatever combination of land, labor, and surviving kin actually remained functional. No single record captures how common this kind of improvised cooperation became, but the demographic arithmetic of the period, fewer people, more vacant land, and a shared memory of exactly how quickly isolation could turn fatal, made some version of it almost inevitable in village after village. This consolidation should not be mistaken for a uniform pattern across the continent, since local conditions of land tenure, lordship, and available population varied considerably from one region to another. In some areas, particularly where population loss had been most severe, surviving tenants found themselves able to negotiate significantly improved terms for expanded holdings, while in other regions where losses had been more moderate, the pre-famine pattern of small, fragmented tenancies persisted largely unchanged. The demographic effect extended beyond direct mortality into reduced fertility during and immediately after the crisis years. Malnourished populations experience lower conception rates and higher rates of infant and maternal mortality, and the birth cohorts of the famine years and the years immediately following were smaller than they would otherwise have been, a delayed consequence that continued to shape population figures for a generation after the acute crisis had passed. This demographic shadow meant that the famine's true population effect extended well beyond the direct mortality of 1315 through 1317, a generation that should have been born during those years, and that would ordinarily have grown into the workforce and tax base of the 1330s and 1340s, simply existed in smaller numbers than population trends before the crisis would have predicted. A gap that showed up decades later in the size of the adult population without any single dramatic event to explain it beyond the famine itself. Marriage patterns shifted as well, as economic uncertainty during and after the crisis led some households to delay marriage until conditions stabilized, further compressing the birth rate during these years beyond what mortality and fertility effects alone would explain. Manor court records tracking inheritance and marriage licensing from the years following the famine show, in some regions, a temporary decline in the rate of new households being formed, consistent with a population choosing caution over expansion in the aftermath of a crisis that had demonstrated so starkly how quickly prosperity could collapse. Land abandonment, which had begun in small numbers during the winter of 1315 and grown through 1316, left a visible mark on the rural landscape that outlasted the famine itself by decades. Marginal holdings, the hillside terraces, drained fen plots, and forest clearings brought into cultivation during the population boom of the preceding centuries, were abandoned in significant numbers, their tenants dead, fled, or simply unable to continue farming land that had never produced a reliable surplus even in good years. Some of this abandoned land reverted, over subsequent decades, back toward the woodland or rough pasture it had been cleared from before the expansion of the 13th century, a slow ecological reversal that mirrored the demographic contraction driving it. Manor lords who had once counted on rents from dozens of marginal tenancies found some of those tenancies simply empty, with no new tenant willing or available to take on land whose poor productivity had been demonstrated so starkly during the crisis. This reversion carried its own economic logic once the immediate crisis had passed. Marginal land that had only been profitable to farm when population pressure left no better alternative became, in a smaller post-famine population, simply not worth the labor required to work it, and rational economic calculation on the part of surviving tenants and lords alike favored abandoning the least productive holdings in favor of concentrating effort on the better land that remained. Some lords attempted to prevent this abandonment, offering reduced rents or other incentives to keep marginal tenancies occupied and generating at least some income rather than none. These efforts met with mixed success, since a tenant weighing the offer had to balance the modest concession against the ongoing risk that marginal land, having already failed catastrophically once, might fail again in the next difficult season, an outcome the recent crisis had made vivid and impossible to dismiss as unlikely. This abandonment produced one of the famine's most significant and least immediately visible consequences, a shift in the balance of power between landlords and the tenants who remained. A smaller rural population meant that surviving tenants and the laborers who worked for wages rather than as tenant farmers found themselves in a stronger negotiating position than their parents and grandparents had occupied during the crowded, land-hungry decades before the crisis. Labor that had once been abundant and therefore cheap became comparatively scarce, and lords competing for a reduced pool of available tenants and workers found themselves increasingly willing to offer better terms than custom had traditionally required. Lower rents, more favorable inheritance conditions, occasionally outright wages for labor that had previously been extracted as an unpaid feudal obligation. This shift did not happen everywhere at once, and it did not overturn the feudal order outright in the years immediately following the famine, but it established a pattern of leverage that rural workers had not possessed at the same scale before 1315. The shift in bargaining power extended into how disputes between lords and tenants were resolved in the manor courts that governed daily rural life. Surviving court entries from the years following the famine reveal, in a number of regions, tenants more willing to contest traditional obligations and lords more willing to compromise on disputed terms than the equivalent entries from the decades before 1315, a subtle but measurable change in the texture of manorial governance. This change did not arrive as a single dramatic reform, and no king or council declared feudal obligation altered by decree in the years immediately following the famine. It arrived instead as an accumulation of individual negotiations, each one small, each one specific to a particular lord and a particular tenant, that together shifted the practical balance of the system even while its formal legal structure remained officially unchanged. Urban populations experienced their own distinct pattern of consequence, shaped by the specific vulnerabilities that had made cities like the Flemish cloth towns so exposed during the crisis. Some towns lost a significant share of their population to death and outmigration during the worst years, and the textile industries that depended on stable, skilled urban labor took time to rebuild the workforce the famine had disrupted. Merchants and craft guilds that survived the crisis often emerged from it with consolidated market position, since smaller competitors without sufficient reserves to weather 3 years of disrupted trade had, in some cases, been forced out of business entirely. This consolidation was not a deliberate outcome sought by anyone, but it followed directly from the same basic mechanism that had determined which rural households survived: access to reserves and credit sufficient to absorb an extended shock, rather than any advantage in skill or industriousness alone. Guild structures in some cloth towns emerged from the crisis, with membership requirements and entry costs that had in practice risen simply because fewer new members were able to accumulate the capital needed to enter a trade that had spent 3 years generating reduced income for nearly everyone involved in it. This had the effect, whether intended or not, of protecting the market position of established guild members who had survived the crisis against a wave of new competitors that a less disrupted economy might otherwise have produced. Urban charitable institutions, like their rural counterparts, emerged from the crisis having distributed a significant share of whatever reserves they had accumulated in better years, leaving many town hospitals and almshouses in a weakened financial position even as the acute need for their services gradually declined alongside improving harvests. Rebuilding these institutional reserves took years, and some towns responded by establishing more formal and centralized systems of poor relief than had existed before the crisis, an early step toward the kind of municipal social welfare structures that would develop more fully in later centuries. The political consequences of the famine proved harder to trace directly to specific outcomes than the demographic and economic effects, but the erosion of confidence in royal and feudal authority that began with incidents like the bread shortage during Edward II's 1315 progress did not simply fade once the immediate crisis passed. Kings and lords, who had proven unable to protect their subjects from catastrophe, despite considerable effort and genuine attempts at intervention, retained a diminished aura of protective authority that had underpinned much of feudal legitimacy in the centuries before the crisis. In England specifically, Edward II's reign, already troubled by military failure in Scotland and conflict with elements of the nobility, absorbed the famine as one more strain on a monarchy that was already under considerable pressure from multiple directions. The famine did not by itself cause the political crises that would eventually lead to Edward II's deposition in 1327, but it contributed to a broader pattern of failed royal competence that weakened confidence in his rule during a reign already marked by difficulty. The barons who eventually moved against Edward II drew on years of accumulated grievance that extended well beyond the famine, including military setbacks and disputes over royal favorites, and it would be inaccurate to describe the famine as a primary cause of his eventual downfall. But the famine years occupy a specific place within that longer narrative of weakening royal authority, contributing one more episode in which the crown appeared unable to protect its subjects from disaster despite genuine attempts at intervention. Similar patterns of strained but not immediately fractured royal authority appeared elsewhere in Europe during and after the famine years, as kings and princes across the continent faced populations that had watched royal interventions in currency, prices, and food distribution fail to meaningfully improve their circumstances. No single monarchy collapsed as a direct result of the famine, but the crisis left behind, in kingdom after kingdom, a population somewhat more skeptical of the crown's protective capacity than it had been before 1315. Grain markets and trade networks that had failed so completely during the crisis prompted, in some regions, renewed attention to the question of reserve capacity and market resilience, though the institutional memory of this attention proved uneven and often faded as the immediate crisis receded further into the past. Some towns expanded civic granaries in the years following the famine, building storage capacity intended to buffer against a repeat of the shortage that had proven so devastating, an early and imperfect form of the kind of food security planning that would become more systematic in later centuries. These granary expansions varied considerably in scale and effectiveness from one town to another, and few of them possessed the capacity to meaningfully buffer against a crisis of the magnitude the region had just endured. But they represented a genuine, if modest, institutional learning process, a recognition on the part of civic authorities that the pre-famine assumption of adequate market resilience through ordinary trade had proven inadequate, and that some measure of deliberate reserve building was worth the cost even in years when no crisis appeared imminent. Transport infrastructure also received renewed attention in some regions, as the failures of road and river transport during the crisis had demonstrated how easily even a functioning regional surplus could become useless if it could not physically reach the population that needed it. Some towns and lords invested in improved road maintenance and river management in the years following the famine, motivated at least in part by the vivid memory of grain sitting undelivered while nearby populations starved, unable to move it fast enough to matter. The famine's effect on the wool and cloth trade connecting England to Flanders illustrates how a crisis rooted in grain could ripple outward into economic relationships that had nothing directly to do with bread. Reduced flocks, weakened by disease, and by the same fodder shortages that had struck cattle, meant reduced wool output at exactly the moment Flemish weavers were themselves recovering from famine-related disruption to their own workforce, and the trade relationship between the two regions took years to return to its pre-famine volume. This slow recovery in the wool trade carried consequences beyond the immediate merchants and weavers directly involved in it. The English crown, which relied heavily on customs revenue from wool exports to fund its own operations and its ongoing military campaigns, faced reduced income during precisely the years when it was also managing the political and administrative strain of the famine's other effects. A fiscal squeeze layered on top of every other pressure the crisis had already produced. Flemish cities, for their part, had to rebuild not only their wool supply, but the skilled weaving workforce the famine had reduced through death and outmigration, a process that took considerably longer than the agricultural recovery itself, since skilled textile labor could not simply be replaced overnight. This period is often treated as one phase within a longer restructuring of the Flemish textile industry across the 14th century, though attributing any single long-term change entirely to the famine risks overstating a crisis that was one significant disruption among several the industry faced during these decades. Perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of the Great Famine was not any single visible change, but the demonstration it provided to peasants, lords, kings, and clergy alike that the entire system built during 3 centuries of favorable climate and expanding population had almost no capacity to absorb a genuinely severe, sustained shock. Every institution that had presented itself, implicitly or explicitly, as protection against catastrophe, had been tested during these 3 years and had, in one way or another, fallen short of what it promised. The famine also left a mark on how contemporaries wrote and thought about their own recent past, treating the crisis years as a distinct and identifiable episode, rather than simply folding them into an undifferentiated memory of hard times. Chroniclers writing in the decades after 1317 continued to reference the famine specifically when describing the general precariousness of the human condition, using it as a fixed point of comparison for later hardships in a way that suggests it had lodged in collective memory as something categorically different from the ordinary bad years that had come before and would come again. Villagers of a later generation, hearing their grandparents describe those years, inherited a specific vocabulary for describing genuine crisis, a way of distinguishing an ordinary lean season from a catastrophe on the scale of what their elders had actually lived through. That distinction, passed down informally through household memory rather than any written record, may have shaped how rural communities assessed and responded to hardship for decades after anyone who had personally survived the famine itself had died. This demonstration did not immediately transform feudal society, and the basic structures of manorial obligation, royal governance, and church authority remained substantially intact in the years right after the famine ended. But the crisis had exposed a fragility that could not simply be unlearned, and it left behind a population in both the countryside and the towns that carried direct memory of exactly how quickly the promises of a stable social order could fail against a hazard the order had never been designed to withstand. Parents who had lived through the famine as children carried that memory into adulthood, into their own decisions about how much grain to store, how much to trust a lord's assurances, and how quickly to abandon marginal land rather than risk repeating what they had witnessed as children. This transmission of caution across a generation is difficult to trace in any single document, but it appears consistently as an undertone in the agricultural and economic decisions of the decades following the famine, a population behaving as though it had learned, at considerable cost, not to assume that the system protecting it was as reliable as it had once believed. That memory, and the specific vulnerabilities the famine had exposed, a population living close to the edge of what marginal land could support, a system of fixed obligation with almost no flexibility, and institutions capable of charity only at a scale far smaller than a genuine crisis required, would not simply fade once the immediate hunger passed. They remained present in the structure of European society through the years that followed, waiting to be tested again by whatever crisis came next. None of these vulnerabilities had been fully addressed by the time normal harvests resumed. The population that had shrunk during the famine began, in most regions, a gradual recovery once conditions improved, and within a generation many of the same underlying pressures, a population once again growing toward the limits of available farmland, a feudal structure still built around fixed obligation despite the concessions extracted during crisis, institutions of charity still calibrated to handle isolated hardship rather than sustained catastrophe, had reasserted themselves in modified but recognizable form. What had changed permanently was the demonstrated fact of vulnerability itself. Before 1315, the assumption that a functioning kingdom could reliably feed its population had gone largely untested by anything beyond isolated regional misfortune. After 1317, that assumption could no longer be taken for granted by anyone who had lived through what a genuinely severe, sustained shock could do to even the wealthiest and best-governed parts of Europe. Fewer than 30 years later, one did. In 1347, a disease unlike anything Europe had encountered in centuries arrived at Mediterranean ports, carried on trading ships, and within a few years it had killed a share of the continent's population that dwarfed even the losses of the Great Famine. The Black Death is usually told as a story on its own terms, a catastrophe arriving without warning into a world unprepared for it. But the population that plague swept through in 1347 was not the same population, in physical condition or in social structure, that had existed before the famine of 1315 through 1317, and the connection between the two crises runs deeper than simple sequence. Malnutrition experienced in childhood leaves lasting effects on the immune system and general health of the adult that child becomes. effects that persist for decades after the period of hunger itself has ended. A significant portion of the adult population living in Europe in 1347 had either lived through the Great Famine directly or had been born to parents whose own health and resources had been shaped by it, carrying into adulthood a degree of physical vulnerability that a population with an uninterrupted history of adequate nutrition would not have shared. This does not mean the famine caused the Black Death, or that the plague would have spared a healthier population entirely. The disease that arrived in 1347 was ferociously lethal by any standard, killing well-nourished and malnourished victims alike across every level of society. But a population already weakened by one severe, sustained crisis was less able to resist a second one arriving barely a generation later, and the extraordinarily high mortality rates the plague produced in some regions likely reflected, in part, a population entering the crisis with less physical resilience than it would otherwise have possessed. The chronological gap between the two crises matters directly to this argument. 30 years is roughly the span of a single generation, meaning that the adults who bore the heaviest burden of plague mortality in 1347 included a substantial cohort who had spent their own childhoods or their earliest years of adulthood living through the hunger of 1315 through 1317, their bodies shaped by exactly the kind of early life deprivation that leaves lasting biological consequences. Children born during or shortly after the famine years, in particular, would have entered the plague years as adults in their 30s, precisely the working-age population a medieval economy depended on most heavily, and precisely the cohort whose early nutritional deprivation would have left the deepest and most lasting mark on their long-term health. This is not a claim that can be proven with the precision a modern epidemiological study would require, given the limits of the surviving evidence, but it represents a plausible and biologically grounded connection between two crises that are usually discussed in complete isolation from one another. The institutional damage the famine had done compounded this vulnerability in a second, less biological way. Grain reserves, charitable capacity, and civic emergency response, every one of the systems that had already proven inadequate against the famine, had only partially recovered by 1347, meaning that when plague struck, many of the same institutions that had failed the population once already were asked to respond to an even larger catastrophe with resources that had not fully rebuilt. Monastic houses that had exhausted their charitable reserves during the famine years and that had spent the following decades slowly rebuilding those reserves found themselves facing the plague with stores that had only recently returned to something approaching their pre-famine levels. The plague's own direct effect on these institutions compounded the problem further, killing monks and clergy in numbers proportionally similar to the general population, leaving surviving religious houses simultaneously less staffed and less resourced at the exact moment demand for their charitable and pastoral functions spiked to unprecedented levels. Civic granaries and market institutions that towns had begun building in the aftermath of the famine, intended as a hedge against exactly this kind of repeated crisis, generally proved too modest in scale to meaningfully buffer a population against the plague's demographic impact, since the plague's threat was disease rather than food scarcity, and no quantity of stored grain could address a crisis of that different nature. This mismatch between the lesson institutions had drawn from the famine and the actual shape of the crisis that followed illustrates a persistent difficulty in institutional learning. Societies tend to prepare most effectively for a repeat of the last crisis, even when the next one arrives in an entirely different form. The demographic consequence of the plague, layered onto a population already reduced by the famine a generation earlier, produced a labor shortage of a scale and duration that the famine's own more modest population loss had only begun to suggest. Where the famine had shifted bargaining power between lords and tenants gradually through scattered local negotiation, the plague collapsed the available labor supply so severely and so quickly that the shift became impossible for any lord or king to ignore or resist. Surviving peasants after the plague found themselves in a negotiating position that the concessions won during the famine years had only foreshadowed. With a substantial share of the workforce dead, lords desperate for tenants and laborers had to offer wages and terms that would have been unthinkable in the crowded, land-hungry decades before 1315, and workers who had once been bound to a single manor by custom and law found themselves able to leave for better terms elsewhere, with a leverage no prior generation of peasants had possessed. This leverage manifested in concrete, documented ways across the decades following the plague. Agricultural wages in England, tracked through surviving manorial and royal account records, rose substantially in the years after 1349 compared to the levels that had prevailed before the plague, a rise that persisted despite repeated legal attempts to suppress it. Tenants negotiated conversion of labor obligations into cash rents on more favorable terms than had been available before either crisis, and some abandoned marginal holdings entirely in favor of better land left vacant by the plague's mortality, completing a process of consolidation that the famine had only begun. Kings attempted to reverse this shift by legal decree, and in England the Statute of Labourers, passed by Parliament in 1351, attempted to freeze wages at their pre-plague rates, treating the labor shortage as a temporary distortion that law could simply correct. The statute failed almost immediately in practice, as employers desperate for workers routinely paid above the legal maximum, despite the risk of penalty, and laborers who could find better terms elsewhere had every incentive to leave a position that paid only the frozen legal rate. The failure of the Statute of Laborers illustrates, in sharper and more visible form, the same lesson the famine had already begun teaching a generation earlier, that fixed legal or economic arrangements designed for a world of abundant, cheap labor could not simply be preserved by decree once the underlying population balance that had made those arrangements possible no longer existed. The economic floor that governed how much a peasant's labor was worth had shifted permanently, and no law, however forcefully enforced, was capable of moving it back to where it had stood before. The parallel between the failed price controls of the famine years and the failed wage controls following the plague is worth stating plainly, because it illustrates a pattern that recurs across the entire episode this account has traced. Edward II's attempt to fix livestock prices in 1315 and the English Parliament's attempt to fix wages in 1351 both addressed real and understandable grievances, merchants profiting from scarcity in the first case, laborers demanding what lords considered excessive wages in the second, and both failed for structurally identical reasons, because neither law could alter the underlying scarcity of grain in one case and of labor in the other. That was actually driving the price it attempted to control. Over the following decades, the gradual erosion of feudal obligation that the famine had quietly begun accelerated dramatically in the plague's aftermath as serfdom weakened and eventually disappeared across much of Western Europe, replaced by wage labor and more flexible forms of tenancy that a labor-scarce economy demanded. This long transformation from feudal obligation toward a wage-based rural economy is generally traced to the plague years as its main accelerant, but the pattern of concession and negotiated flexibility that made this transformation possible had already been rehearsed on a smaller scale during the Great Famine 3 decades earlier. The famine's long thread extends beyond the specific chain connecting it to the Black Death and the collapse of serfdom into questions that remain directly relevant to how societies think about food security in the present day. The core vulnerability the famine exposed, a population dependent on a food system with almost no buffer against a sustained severe disruption, is not a medieval problem alone, and modern agricultural and economic systems continue to grapple with versions of the same basic question the 14th century faced without warning or preparation. Contemporary discussions of climate change and agricultural policy frequently return to a concern that would have been entirely familiar to a farmer working a field in 1314. How much resilience does a food system need to carry against a run of unfavorable growing seasons? And who bears the cost of building that resilience before a crisis arrives rather than after? Modern strategic grain reserves, agricultural insurance programs, and international food aid networks all represent, in different institutional forms, an attempt to solve the same underlying problem that 14th century Europe had almost no capacity to address: how to prevent a bad harvest from becoming a catastrophe. The specific mechanism connecting 14th century weather to 14th century famine, a shift in atmospheric and oceanic patterns disrupting rainfall across an entire region for multiple consecutive growing seasons, is not a purely historical phenomenon confined to the medieval period. Modern climate science continues to study the same North Atlantic oscillation and related weather patterns that likely contributed to the onset of the Great Famine, now with the added concern of how a warming climate may alter the frequency or severity of the kind of extended wet, cool growing seasons that struck Europe in 1315 and 1316. This continuity between medieval and modern climate concerns does not suggest that today's agricultural systems face the same absolute vulnerability that 14th century Europe did, since modern crop diversity, transportation networks, and international trade in food provide buffers against regional crop failure that simply did not exist 7 centuries ago. But the underlying question the famine forces onto anyone who studies it seriously: what happens to a food system pushed to the edge of its production capacity when the climate it was built around begins to shift, remains a live and unresolved question for modern agricultural and climate policy, not a settled matter safely confined to the past. The debate over minimum wage and labor protections that continues in many countries today traces a line, however indirect, back to the same basic tension that first cracked open during the Great Famine and then broke apart entirely during the plague that followed it. The tension between what a fixed legal or customary arrangement promises and what an underlying economic reality can actually support. The Statute of Laborers failed because it tried to legislate away a shift in bargaining power that had already happened in practice, a lesson that continues to inform how modern policymakers think about the limits of wage regulation in the face of genuine shifts in labor supply and demand. This is not to suggest that modern wage floors are doomed to the same failure, since a modern economy with different tools of enforcement, different information systems, and a fundamentally different relationship between labor and capital operates under conditions the 14th century never faced. But the core question the Statute of Laborers failed to answer whether a legal price ceiling or floor can hold against a genuine underlying shift in supply and demand, or whether it will simply drive the transaction it targets into forms the law cannot reach, remains a live and contested question in modern labor economics, argued in essentially the same terms that would have been familiar to the officials trying to enforce Edward III's wage freeze in the 1350s. Even the specific vulnerability of grain-dependent urban populations, so starkly exposed in the Flemish cloth towns of 1315, has a direct echo in the modern world, where cities and countries with limited domestic agricultural capacity remain dependent on global trade networks to feed populations that produce little of their own food. The disruption of grain shipments during recent conflicts and trade disputes has demonstrated, in a modern context, the same basic fragility that a flooded road or an impassable river demonstrated in the summer of 1315. That food security depends not only on whether enough food exists somewhere in the world, but on whether it can actually reach the people who need it through transport and market systems that can themselves fail under sufficient strain. A weaver's family in Ypres, working looms passed down through 2 generations by the time the famine struck, would have understood this dependence in the most immediate terms possible. Their livelihood came from cloth, not grain, and every loaf on their table had traveled some distance to reach them long before the crisis began, carried by a trade network they had never needed to think about because it had never before failed to deliver. When that network faltered in 1315, a household with skill, capital, and a functioning workshop found itself just as exposed to hunger as any tenant farmer on marginal land, a vulnerability that had nothing to do with their own competence or effort, and everything to do with a structural dependence they shared with tens of thousands of households across the region. That same structural vulnerability, in different form, describes the position of any modern city or nation that has built genuine prosperity on specialization and trade rather than direct food production, trusting a network of ships, roads, and markets to deliver what its own land no longer needs to supply. Modern grain-exporting regions occupy a role in the global food system, not unlike the one Baltic grain producers occupied for medieval Flanders, supplying importing regions that have chosen, for reasons of geography, economics, or land use, not to produce the bulk of their own food domestically. This arrangement carries real efficiency benefits in ordinary times, allowing regions to specialize according to their comparative agricultural advantages, rather than each attempting self-sufficiency at greater overall cost. But it carries the identical structural risk that undid the Flemish cloth towns 7 centuries ago, a dependence on distant supply that functions well until the moment supply and transport both falter simultaneously, at which point a region with no local production capacity of its own has very little to fall back on. Price control debates in the modern world echo the Flemish town councils and Edward II's Livestock proclamation just as directly as modern wage debates echo the Statute of Laborers. Governments responding to sudden price spikes in food or energy continue to reach, periodically, for price caps and controls similar in basic logic to the measures Ypres and Bruges attempted in 1315. And these modern interventions frequently produce a version of the same unintended consequence: sellers withholding goods from a capped market in favor of an uncapped one elsewhere, shortages shifting rather than resolving. The specific commodities and legal mechanisms have changed considerably across 7 centuries, but the basic economic logic that undermined price controls in medieval Flanders has not changed nearly as much as the intervening centuries might suggest. None of these modern echoes suggest that history simply repeats itself in identical form, and the institutions, technologies, and scientific understanding available to address food security today bear little resemblance to what existed in 14th century Europe. But the underlying structure of the problem, population pressed against the limits of what its food system can reliably support, fixed obligations that cannot bend to meet a bad year, and the gap between what institutions promise in times of crisis and what they can actually deliver, has not disappeared simply because the specific technologies and institutions surrounding it have changed. Recognizing this underlying structure does not require treating the 14th century as a direct blueprint for the present, since the differences between a medieval manorial economy and a modern globalized food system are far too significant to ignore. What the famine offers instead is something closer to a diagnostic pattern, a clear, well-documented case study in what happens when a system built around an assumption of stability meets a sustained disruption to that stability, and what kinds of institutional response tend to help and what kinds tend to make the underlying problem worse. The distinction the famine illustrates between measures that redistribute an existing shortage and measures that actually increase the underlying supply remains directly applicable to how modern societies evaluate their own crisis responses, whether the crisis in question involves food, energy, housing, or any other good whose supply can be disrupted faster than institutions can adapt to the disruption. A policy that simply moves scarcity from one place to another, however well-intentioned, has not solved the crisis it addresses. It has only decided who bears the cost of it. The Great Famine of 1315 through 1317 rarely appears in popular accounts of medieval history, overshadowed by the Black Death that followed it and by other, more dramatic episodes of the same turbulent century. But it deserves its own place in that history, not simply as a prelude to the plague, but as the first clear demonstration that the world Europe had built during 300 years of favorable climate and steadily rising population carried, at its foundation, a vulnerability that no king, no lord, and no institution of the period had the tools to fully address. Reconstructing that demonstration in detail, the flooded fields of 1315, the empty royal table, the failed price controls, the debased coinage, the chronicler's uncertain reports of the worst that hunger could produce, does more than satisfy curiosity about a distant and largely forgotten crisis. It offers a clear, sustained example of how a system can fail, not through any single catastrophic error, but through the compounding of ordinary decisions made by ordinary people and institutions, each one reasonable within its own limited view, none of them equal to the scale of what they were actually facing. That vulnerability did not begin with the rain that fell in the spring of 1315, and it did not end when the weather finally improved in 1317. It was written into the structure of a society that had expanded further and faster than the land beneath it could reliably sustain, a structure that would be tested again, more severely, within a single generation, and whose basic questions about resilience, obligation, and the fragile link between weather and survival remain, in different forms, unresolved even now. 2 harvests failed. A third came slowly back. A kingdom learned what its promises were worth. A king went without bread at his own table, and a continent understood, in that single small fact, everything it needed to know about the limits of power against weather. The rain stopped eventually. The fields dried and were planted again, and gave back some small portion of what they had taken. The people did not fully recover, not for a generation. Not before the next crisis arrived, carried on a ship, and found a world still weaker than it looked. Some things broke that never fully mended. Some things bent and held and are still bending now. This has been Quiet History at Bedtime. If you found value in this story, a subscribe, a like, or turning on notifications helps this channel keep telling the histories that go untold. Thank you for listening and for letting this play through to the end. Good night and sleep well.